Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Delighted today to be rejoined by Dr. Adam Gamwell, who was first on the show back in 2019. I was just telling the story of Sound Education panel where we met also in 2019. Yeah. And interestingly enough, that episode, which was on robots, sci-fi, and the anthropological imagination, has been popping. It's been getting more downloads lately, which I think is a testimony to a good title and B, a good conversation between the two of us. We'll get into all that as part of the conversation, but just to start, Adam, welcome back to Trending in Ed.
Yo, Mike, thanks for having me back. I guess I didn't break things too much last time, and excited to be with you. I always enjoy the conversation. And yeah, man, it is trippy that, conversations that we were having 6 years ago now are finding their way back into the zeitgeist. What's up with that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm assuming it's a good thing. They do say even a broken clock is right twice a day. So,
right.
So this episode from 2019 is bouncing back. You've been up to some interesting stuff. I did, in terms of using the tools, I did drop the transcript from our prior conversation into Gemini 3, which I've been pretty impressed with, kind of framing the conversation. And what's interesting about your story is that anthropology professor, podcaster as well. So we're looking at trends. You recently were at the American Anthropological Association's annual meeting. So you're on a panel on AI there. But I thought it was interesting that you went from predicting the future to some of the work that you've been doing. You're really hands-on with AI, working with Mindshare and some other ventures around getting the anthropological mindset integrated with AI in some interesting ways. Can you catch us up on what your life's been like? I know you're now a dad as well, which is a big life change. There might have been a pandemic in there as well as the launch of ChatGPT. So three things have happened since we talked last. Catch us up however you think makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Just a few things have taken place in the past few years, I guess like some of the most relevant pieces are that, been working in anthropology the entire time and always was interested in the technology angle. I've always been a computer nerd the entire time, which is I think why we talked about sci-fi and robots in the first place.
Yeah.
And then, what's interesting is that since 2019, since the old pandemic, that was one of the major shifts that it seems almost ironic to us that we're talking on Zoom and we don't even think about that, right? But like, if you remember, that was the moment that we all began doing that, like as a common practice. And so that like both worked for podcasters, but it also was a big thing for doing ethnographic research for clients. Prior to 2019 or prior to 2020, it was like really common to go do field research. And it is again now in end of 2025. But, forever it changed the way that we do research and that we do a lot more digital online research. And that can be, doing surveys online, it can be doing interviews. And that's only accelerated, right? In terms of now that AI has kind of come on, or generative AI has come onto the scene. And so I both followed those trends because I had to in order to find work, and also, got really interested in the space, especially as, GPT came on the scene that folks could then do the chatbot experience. And now, you're just saying that you're using Gemini 3 from Google. So like there's been an insane explosion of models that have come out in what they can do and capabilities and tool calling, and we can talk about that stuff. But for me, it's helped to kind of rack the anthropological practice as we think about both how can we do the research, but then on top of that, like how can we think about maybe what we say is computational anthropology, right? We have access to tools now that we can kind of think at scale that we couldn't do before, where if I'm doing interviews or I'm kind of doing in situ observation with a group of people over a few days or something. Now you can kind of both, we can discuss the ethics of this. You can do like synthetic data and like have use synthetic people to kind of do some of that research. But also, we can ask for trends over time. This cat is real. It's not a synthetic cat.
That's nice. Yeah.
It's a good background motion, but there's an interesting piece happening here where we can think about what research can be, what can anthropology be. So it's kind of come down to something of a identity question, and so I've been getting more into the AI space in terms of learning to build software. Some people positively or negatively might call this vibe coding, but I would say I'm doing vibe coding plus, where I understand more about what is actually being built. I don't just type it, make me a pretty website. But, it's changed that kind of question of how we could think about what research is possible and what questions we can ask. And then when I said the idea of scale, one way we could think about this is that, if we're working with a small group or a big group, there's one discipline that's really good, I think, at kind of helping us think about civilizational level questions. And that I think is anthropology. Why that matters now is because, again, we can get really big really quickly in terms of the types of questions, the types of scales of time we can think about, and then just small things, right? Like instead of just searching online now for how to fix a leaky pipe, I can, literally open my phone and open the Gemini app and then have it live view what I'm looking at and then ask it questions about how do I fix the pipe. So think about that again for research questions is huge, right? You can kind of have a research companion with you at all times. And then, there's pieces of how do we think about that too. So anyway, I've compiled a bunch of that stuff into Mindshare, as you mentioned, and this is an organization, a startup that I'm working with two other colleagues. And we're basically trying to help bring anthropology more squarely into consumer insights, to market research, into business. Like how do we kind of bring the anthropological imagination from academia into the business space so we can have more influence and impact on business and society. So that's what we've been doing, just a few small things.
Yeah, and plenty in there. And then in terms of the trend line for the anthropological imagination and kind of going deeper on like ethnography and human context, it does seem from my vantage point, there's been a bit of a broader awakening, perhaps driven by AI, in that AI is going to be amazing at some things, but it's not going to be all the way there. You mentioned some of the opportunity, but then also the challenges around synthetic data and digital twins. Some of the things we talked about kind of as hypotheticals 6 years ago, we're now like living through a radical transformation. How do you think all of the technology changes, even the pandemic, how do you think they've affected the broader perspective on anthropology and perhaps the need for more anthropological thinking?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's a sort of force that is asking us to ask better questions and deeper questions about what it means to be human today, as both AI, but then also like its neighbor, robotics, is kind of coming into the equation too. Like we don't have a ton of robotics on the space yet, but there's people that have those like physical AI pins that kind of record everything that you do.
Right. I was listening to Hard Fork and they interviewed the CEO of Neo, which is basically like robot butlers. He was saying he thought robot butlers would be relatively prevalent in the next year and a half. So we'll see. We'll see. I got my back order in.
Right. Yeah. As long as it comes with a bow tie, then I'm okay with it.
Certainly better make a nice martini, but that's another conversation.
Right. So the shaking motion is really hard though, kind of like, or can break the joints.
And it just stirred.
Just stirs. But that is also raising these interesting questions of what is it, how do we be human in the world, right? When we already have to, I think anthropologically we've come to reckon with, we say it's a study of humanity, but we have to think about, of course, the more than human world, right? And that has come to include plants, animals, environment, things like that. But now we have to add in these like other agentic species almost, right? Both kind of a form of intelligence with AI and then also potentially other bodied beings with robots. The funny thing is, AI and robots aren't new in terms of being in our world, but they're new both in consumer life because they're making more products for consumers, but also they're automating work in new ways that they haven't done before. And so there is that interesting piece of, how do we think about what it means to be human today? And the flip side is then how do we make sure that we're keeping humanity in that equation, right? I know it sounds weird, like as we have more agentic AI now that AI can run for long times, kind of autonomously without us having to intervene with it. Like even if it's doing a coding project or just working on some problem of drug discovery, for example, when and where do you put humans in the loop is one of the questions that I think is really interesting. And so there's these kind of like technical questions, but again, the anthropological question there too is like, there's this side of like, where do we keep humans in the equation and what does it mean to be human? And then the other side is, I think the correct term of AI slop, that there's been so much stuff generated out on the internet that there's theories that the internet is dead now, which is a provocative idea because it's just a bunch of, I don't want to say fake stuff, but it's just like, nonsense produced. And that's a challenging question.
Pollution and noise.
And so how do we think about noise and pollution in that space, right? Like the idea of human creation of taste, we might say too, right? That's what I've seen a lot of conversations from tech leaders and other folks kind of across the spectrum saying like the new thing is going to be taste. Having AI agents do that. So there's this interesting piece of like, I'm not convinced that we're going to, just totally replace every single, like we raise the bar every time, right? That we're going to go from like emotional AI into taste and blah, 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 and like kind of push the human out of the equation. But the thing is we want to create, we want to make, right? And I'm finding that on the consumer side and consumer insights or market research, AI is helping to do more automation work. But the things that actually stick with people are moments that allow humans to create and to build community, like things that are thousands, hundreds of thousands of years old that are human are still fundamentally important. And you can't, like the point is not to automate those away. So there is this tension of like, how do we usefully think about automation and AI, but then how do we still honor and nurture those parts of the human that have been fundamental to our well-being? And so that tension, I think, is alive and well today.
Yeah. And, it makes me think of the notion of culture, which is another
Mm.
term that's been bandied about. I think it's been bandied about, where
Yeah,
people are
I think
talking
so.
about culture a lot. And then culture from an anthropologist perspective is probably one of the more useful ways of thinking about it. And it's something that, context is the other thing that, I've heard rather than
Mm.
prompt crafting, I've heard folks talk about it as, context engineering and different ways in which you can sort of give the AI deeper contextual understanding, deeper
Yeah.
human experience. But it is Beth Rudden, who's been on the show a bunch of times. She says, data is an artifact of human experience, where in some ways the AIs will always be catching up. They feed off our exhaust to some extent, where like the
Yeah.
data that we leave behind is what then they are quote unquote generative from. But culture is this big thing, and it's something that I think means different things to different people.
Hmm.
Folks like yourself, anthropologists, have probably thought the most about, human cultures and then how human cultures relate to technology. I think I made this reference, and then I heard someone else make the reference of like the Prometheus myth when it comes
Mm.
to, bringing AI as fire. And we are perhaps getting it without the guardrails that we need. And,
Yeah.
those myths don't always end well for the humans. But how are you kind of grokking all of this? And again, grok used to be a term those of us
Yeah.
who liked science fiction would use grok in a way that did not have to do with Elon Musk. But, sadly, some things have moved backwards since 2019. What's your thought on the connection to culture and maybe how people can get better at sense making is another term of art that I think is out there that to me seems very much tied to sort of an ethnographic, anthropological perspective on things.
It's a great question. And as we think about like how do we make sense of our world, it's tricky because I think since 2019 and accelerating through COVID, you know, it seems like culture itself has become more fractured, especially thinking largely in a US context, but we can extrapolate to other parts of the world too. But
Mm-hmm.
just in terms of there's more what we might call microcultures, right? There's just more small groups out there of kind
Mm-hmm.
of, if not isolated, at least like somewhat walled off spaces where
Yep.
you can go and engage with someone or a small group, have some ideas that kind of percolate only in that space and may or may not bubble out. And,
Mm-hmm.
what's the interesting thing about that, being online, of course, is that one, most things are relatively permanent. We're watching some very challenging moments, I think, both between the people and the government in terms of erasing some of those elements. But like, you know, relatively permanent content is out there. Things like the Internet Archive and Wayback Machine. It's also meant that like folks' ideas that are from a relatively small and non-representative group can get amplified also, and get
Mm-hmm.
pushed out further. So this is, part of an algorithm question in terms of like what gets promoted. And we could of course talk about rage bait and all the other ways that we're seeing social media algorithms, kind of promote different ideas to get eyeballs and clicks. But that itself has, I think, helped proliferate this kind of fragmentation of culture. The trick of like sense making with that is, how do you kind of see in multiple directions at once now? It feels like we have to kind of see so many things. And this is this interesting chicken and egg kind of scenario, right? One thing that's really interesting here is, if we play with this Prometheus metaphor, it's like, do we have to use the fire that we've gotten from the gods in order to see the world that we have only been able to create because of the fire? In essence, like, do we need to use AI or other kind of big generative tools in order to study the fragmentation, to understand it? And I kind of think that that's what's happening. And so it's this weird idea that this is something that a colleague in me, Phil Searles, working at Mindshare, have been trying to think through, is that there is this question of like, as the world or culture is more fragmented, like in order to be competent anthropologists today, we have to kind of use the tools of today to understand today, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's this kind of weird idea that like, where it doesn't sound that weird to us to think about, well, you got to look at the clay tablets and the cuneiform that we're looking at. If we're looking at kind of ancient Sumeria and ancient cultures to understand how they use language, kind of how we're using language today involves these AI tools, right? And like more so and more so. And that has implications for, again, how, again, little microcultures are bubbling up and how people communicate, the kind of slop that's on the internet, like what a I don't know, a person that's hiring is going to expect on a job application? Like, are they looking for like watermarks of AI writing, like professors getting annoyed at students for using AI to write essays? So all these kinds of things, like in terms of the culture question, right? It's like shifting how we both create and like put out things into the internet, into the world for jobs, for school, for work, but then also the tools that we need to understand what's even happening. So it's kind of recursive, I guess, in a weird way.
Dwayne Matthews, who's great. I had him on the show. He's a sharp guy out of Canada, out of Toronto. But he talks about epistemic security as the new threat. Like, how do we know what we know? And how is that being more fundamentally shook by the recent waves of technology? It's not just one. AI slop without social media as a distribution engine for it would not be nearly as influential and potentially detrimental. But, it does seem like we're at this tricky point in our collective history. And the other element to it, the other metaphor or historical reference that is interesting is the looms and the Industrial Revolution, and how, the Luddites were actually weavers who were understanding the risks of that new technology to their way of life. And it does feel like that sort of framing around technology as a threat and as something that you can't trust, and you need to to find that sort of epistemic security, to find that safe place, that sort of solid footing to stand on. Maybe you need to turn this stuff off. Touching grass is something that might have meant something different in 2019. Touching grass today, is something, there is a real movement there to kind of turn off the technology. And, I talk about this as kind of like the training wheels problem, where, if you only are learning with these crutches, you may never develop the muscle memory and the independent strength, the cognitive capabilities, the critical thinking that are really going to be fundamental for the 21st century, the rest of the 21st century.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
I think that's right. Both as a fellow dad, it's like, I think deeply about these questions, both of like educating the next generation, of raising kids, then obviously into like older adolescents, teenagers, and adults and beyond. And it's like, there is moments like, a simple example is that, like, when kids are under 5, they can basically absorb any language pretty easily, right? Like, and they can just code switch super easily, and it's kind of like, oh, it's a bummer that shuts off when you get older.
Right.
But after 5, it's like, it gets harder, right? And so then it's just because like the neural pathways kind of congeal in certain ways. And like, that's, something that's good to know. Like, it's like, it's not as fun to realize it afterwards, but like, if you know it ahead of time and you can kind of plan for it, if multilingualism is important to you, then you can sort of account for that. And I think critical thinking, and there's evidence of this, that there's, things like critical thinking as a skill set is also the same kind of idea, right? That like the skill set can atrophy if you don't use it. And there is this challenging point of like, when we have technologies or tools like generative AI that can produce pretty convincing sounding content quickly, it can curtail that sort of critical thinking piece. And this is something that I did talk about. So, it's just at the American Anthropological Association's annual meeting in New Orleans, and we did a panel on AI. And this is something that came up a little bit that I did share with the audience, because it was something that I am concerned about, is as we think about that in an educational context, like, yes, we have seen that there's awareness oftentimes in the classroom of using AI in anthropology classrooms. I'll say, I've heard colleagues talk about that. At first it was the concern that you're cheating by using it to help write an essay. And I think there's a problem with that. But, I said, but that's issue one. But like, really, I think there's 2 more fundamental things that we have to think about. And one is this question of incentives of what is the point of the exercise? What is the point of writing the essay? And if it is to critically think, then by using generative AI, like, then you failed the assignment, like, not because you had AI write it for you, but because you failed to critically think. And so it's a question of both, how do we incentivize and evaluate the kind of work that we want to see, in this case, like promoting critical thinking. But then also the second one is it's a literacy problem. Like, we don't do a good job necessarily of translating why an exercise is important, or why critical thinking, even itself is important. So part of it, I think you're right, that we can lose these skills over time. But then one of the challenge points is like, both how do we continue to promote the muscle memory of something like critical thinking, is we have to be real about the incentives of the kinds of exercises, and like understand that we know that education is changing. The structure of how we teach has changed. Like, we are seeing students students, but across the board, like attention spans are apparently shrinking. We see,
Yeah.
this is written about, Nicholas Carr wrote about this in The Shallows, and like we see it in
Yep.
a bunch of different research,
People are reading fewer long form books.
Yeah,
Yep. Hmm.
like that, and so it's like, I mean, it's not just one area, but we'd have to think about, again, actually, to our cultural fragmentation piece, like there's a lot of different like threads pulling at our attention, and
Hmm.
so as we think about that, we have to kind of ask these deeper questions again. What are the incentives of these exercises, or the processes that we're doing of how we educate, and what is the literacy issue with those? And I mean, that's not to say nothing of the fact that like US literacy reading is like at like 1/3, of adults,
Right.
kids can read above a sixth grade reading level, and that's
Right.
also horrifying in its own way. So AI is not to blame, but it doesn't help if we have zero literacy understanding of how to work with it in order to
Mhm.
promote what we actually want to see in the world. So I think you're absolutely right that we'll lose the muscle memory if we don't. And it's more of a conundrum to try to solve now, I think, than it was before.
Absolutely. And, just talking about sort of the young child concept, I had Amit Sevak on from ETS,
Mm.
and I brought up the cautionary tale or the contrast of in China, they're building AI literacy into their curriculum as young as 6-year-olds. My son
Interesting.
is now 6. And I was a little taken aback by that, but Amit's take was like, you should lean into that. And he even referenced the neuroplasticity that you're talking about,
Mm.
where to be fully literate with the new tools, you could argue you want to expose young kids to that sooner. But
Yeah.
to me, I'm still thinking about it coming off the heels of social media, where we found there is a real challenge to put some of this technology, this emotional, social technology, manipulative technology, persuasive technology,
Mm.
delivering it in a way that is developmentally appropriate. Another quote I like is, AI is great if you're already wise. You know,
Mm. Yep.
providing this technology sort of unaided to folks before they're ready, there's some real challenges, I think, with that too. But then there's also an inevitability to it, right? Like it does
Hmm.
feel like this is, Prometheus in the fire, the genie's out of the bottle, the toothpaste is out of the tube. You can
Yeah.
only step in the same river once. I don't know. They're all relatively true. But what do you think about that? How do you grapple with some of these ideas? Are there frameworks or like habits of thought from anthropology that you think folks might benefit from?
Hmm. It's a deep question. I think that I guess, two things come to mind. One is that, as we think about raising the next generation and raising kids in like what's most important to them, like I do think that understanding technology is foundational, right? But I lean in your direction too, where it's like kids need to go outside. AI is not going to like make it easier to not exercise or not use our bodies, right? It's that like we also are fundamentally physical beings, and I think that's a huge part of how we live in the world. And it's kind of like right now in terms of the Prometheus fire, like we're really excited because fire is new and we are newly warm, or we can cook steak in and for the first time or something.
You might even
And that's
say it. You might even say it's hot.
got it, nailed it right there. Dad joke.
It's fire. Yeah.
It's fire. That fire is fire, man. And so like part of it's like, okay, we're excited. The trick is, of course, we're really excited and we're doing this at like an insanely accelerated rate at scale that social media didn't quite have right when it came out.
Yep.
So part of the question is we didn't learn anything from social media, which is sad, and because we're still effing up kids in our own lives with social media algorithms. But there is the question then too of we also do know what works pretty well. And like some of the stuff I found that's been fun in thinking about parenting is like looking from the critical thinking angle to looking just outside of our own kind of like, ambit orbit circle, and just looking at how other cultures around the world, or we say non-Western ones, like work with child rearing. And like, so, as you probably have found too, that like, in US cultures, it's like can be tricky to, kind of have your kid either change their diaper, or if they're younger, or if they're, get dressed for school, they put their shoes on and get out the door at a certain amount of time. Like we have, as adults, we've been well like trained to work on the clock, So we say, when I say come here, I mean now, not come here when you're done doing whatever you're doing, And they still don't know that, as I'm I'm learning. But what I found is like when, looking at examples amongst Maya communities, looking at the Inuit up in Alaska and Yukon territories, there's these interesting practices that minimally we might say are just more patient, right? And I'm thinking of there's a
Mm.
book, slightly weird title, but called Hunt, Gather, Parent, that a journalist worked on. And, so she visited a number of different cultures because she was having trouble with her own daughter living in San Francisco in terms of like obeying being on time, I mean, all that kind of stuff we're talking about.
I'm
That I
pretty
think it's
sure my wife read this book. So yes.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's one of these things like if you read it and you're like, okay, this makes sense, and you're going to tell somebody about it.
Yeah.
But it's provided some nice kind of ethnographic examples to think with in terms of like how do we add more patience into Western parenting. And like part of it, for me, one thing has just been like recognizing that my son is a year and a half, so he's younger than yours, but still like, we're in the like learning to train phase of like how do we kind of be in the world, or I think more offensively to an anthropologist, but I think still kind of metaphorically correct is from the book The Happiest Toddler on the Block by Dr. Harvey Karp. Like he says, like the work is to kind of civilize the uncivilized little toddlers into
Lord Greystoke. Yeah.
yes, right. These kind of ideas of like how do we show them what it means to be, part of the tribe, or our family tribe in the world today. So one question is the thing of patience, right? When if I'm saying, hey, come here, when you're like, come over here to do X, Y, Z, or let's eat dinner or something, I've learned to say it once and then not say anything, and then proceed to do the activity, and then basically he'll follow when he's ready, for the most part. And that's worked. Like again, it's worked primarily without fail in the sense that like it doesn't cause conflict in terms of like it's not an agency fight,
Mm-hmm.
And so this raised some interesting questions for me in terms of like both how do we think about raising kids so that we're not expecting them to do exactly how we think we should be doing, but then it,
Mm-hmm.
gives me a moment to pause and ask questions back of myself and of parenting and of Western adulthood of like, what are the expectations that are often implicit of how we think the world should work? And then of course, then this, I'm saying all this to both note how we both still have bodies and, we operate and interact with each other in person, like
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally. Then on top of that, there is that question of how do we introduce technology to those interactions and to ourselves? And, we're not quite at screen time yet, with my son, but like we certainly see he'll grab the phone and look at it. And like he's most engaged, interestingly, with when there's like a FaceTime or a Zoom call. He wants to see grandma,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
like someone else on the phone. And like I try to recognize that of like, what is it that is on the screen that is capturing his attention, And so
Mm-hmm.
the funny thing is like, if then you look at like social media data now of like what videos do really well on TikTok, and it's
Yeah.
short verticals of someone's face talking directly at you, looking at the camera.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I'm like, it's not that not different. Right. So like this funny piece of like, I guess part of it is we understand what makes most people typically drawn to something like a screen, And so then if we know that, then I do think it is our responsibility, both as adults, as educators, as working professionals, as just trying to be, normal adults like that are, working for more than just themselves in the world, to like build technologies and tools with each other, for each other a little bit better, right? I think we've on the one hand sort of ceded control as the people, through social media, but then, as it comes to these kind of tools and technologies, like, we are caught a bit off guard by the scale and the speed, but there is, the human is still a huge part of what this is, right? We're not, if you think about it, we're not really reducible. I don't think we are reducible to ones and zeros. Like our brain architecture is not exactly the same as a neural net because it was modeled the other way. It's modeled after our brains as best as we understand them. And
Right.
neuroscience knows a lot, but not everything. And then on top of that, culture too is like often this kind of invisible and unspoken web of norms, behaviors, ways we dress, act, physically and emotionally and verbally and all these pieces. And so it's like on a digital scale, we're able to capture some of that, right? In terms of how, can an AI make sense of the world or help us do research, but we're not entirely singularity like downloaded into the interwebs or AI yet, thankfully.
Yeah.
And so, it's like, again, I don't have the one answer, but it's like, there's a lot of pieces that are moving that like, to me, gives me hope that like, we have still work to do as humans, right? And like that, we're still the equation that matters in terms of like how something gets used, how it gets produced, how it gets distributed. We are ceding more of that control to things like algorithms. And those are the questions we have to ask ourselves. Like, how much of that control do we actually want to give? And what do we want to take responsibility for in terms of, teaching our kids, ourselves, what to be and what to do in
Yeah.
the world.
Mm-hmm. And you're an interesting example, I think, of someone who's now developing stuff with these tools. So there's not just the kind of critical
Distance.
distancing
Yeah.
of this yourself from what's emerging. You've actually made the choice to kind of lean in, and you know the tools themselves could conceivably evolve in the direction that you're heading, where maybe we get more human agency, more control over our feeds, and then also maybe some of these tools could be socio-petal as opposed to socio-fugal, where like the socio-fugal stuff pushes people apart. Socio-petal, it's like the big common table in the middle of a room
Hmm.
brings people together and there is a sense of like shared community around there. Could we redesign some of these things that they are less fracturing and more sort of more designed to bring about that coming together? Thoughts on that? Like you're actually,
Hmm.
you're not a passive recipient of the AI fire. You're actually putting some of that stuff to use more from like perhaps like a maker and like a builder's perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that that's actually a really interesting way to think about what technology can do, like versus kind of bring together or scatter. And yeah, I mean, part of my desire to kind of dive in and get to know the space more, and by learning to build software and actually putting things out in the world that people can use, is part because it's like I was and am tired of a lot of critical distance being the only thing that we see a lot of anthropologists or social scientists do. And I'm not going to ding the discipline as a whole, but just like we need to have more makers in the space. And I think, and that's in part because, again, as we are critiquing tools like this, and we should think critically about them. If we're not making them, we can't critique them. We may not be able to critique them in the most complete ways possible. If we don't understand how the actual bread is baked, we can't be like, well, that's the ingredient that we need to think about, or kind of swap
Right.
that out.
Hmm.
And it's obviously like, I'm not talking about I cannot build you an LLM, but I can build you a chatbot that can then use different LLMs, and then we can kind of fine tune them. And so it's like, as I've gotten my hands more dirty over time, like it has been both about this of like, if we have that experience and we have more people that have expertise or, specialization, like anthropology or sociology or behavioral science or whatever, and we can put those to use in the making process, then we can build tools that would be more socio-petal. If that's our idea of like, how do we help bring people together? And like Clueful that we're working on is like one example is, it's been premised on like, and this is following my work from this Anthro Life podcast through Anthropology in the Public Stage video series we made that was kind of doing essentially media training for anthropologists and any human scientist. And then into now with Clueful is like, how do we help increase the influence and impact of human scientists on society and business? And part of it is like, we have to make the research that we do more accessible to non-academic audiences
Yeah.
and make it easier to find those researchers. I think the major positive is that like with generative AI, I'm now able to build, MVP prototype software, and as well as, version 1.0 and beyond, that helps kind of bring about some of those ideas to life. And like Clueful is, we can take things like industry reports. That's like a consumer insights report. That's like, we'll say McKinsey does, like, here's the state of consumer insights in 2026. In every, consumer insights consulting group, management consulting firm, whatever, design firm does an end of the year report, which I love. It's like Spotify Wrapped, for consumers.
Yeah.
You could dump all those together and then be able to crunch out like meta trends, that's happening. And that's really neat to be able to do,
Hmm.
because then you can get a different form of trend. But then also, like, imagine taking both the individual report, Clueful helps, like, we can slice that up into like individual insights and signals. And so we use some generative AI to help us do that. That makes it very easy to find specific things that you might be looking for. But on top of that, like, what we really want to do is that you can then always find the researcher or the company, depending on where the author level is, to get from that insight back to the producer of the insight, and kind of see the original source content too. And so it's like always making that possible. And so the idea is then to build this with scholars also. So I mean, the dream would be you can dump your dissertation into this, chop it up to as many insights as you want, but then always be able to get back to you. And so we can make it easier to hire human scientists for business problems and business questions. And like,
Yeah.
I'm only able to do that right now. Instead of hiring, a development team, I can kind of make the MVP, make it work, get it going, put it out there in the world, test it with people. And then we can hire a development team to make something. So it's like this nice enablement of what we can do with the tools. And for me, yeah, it's like, again, it's a question of like, I'm playing with fire in order to help keep the fire going.
Yeah.
But it's like, for the ideally good reasons,
Yeah. Cook a meal, keep your family warm. There's lots of things you can
yeah,
take for granted.
that's right. Exactly right. And I'm also tired of academics never getting paid for any work. So it's,
Yeah. Right.
help the team out. And the funny thing is, it's like, we've seen there's been a rise of like business interest. I mean, since the 60s to 90s, there was kind of a slow rise of more social science and business. And like, it kind of went up into the 90s, and they're sort of kind of filtered away a little bit. Like
Yeah.
psychology stuck around, but like anthro and sociology sort of
Hmm.
disappeared from the conversation. And, part of our work is like, let's bring them back, because if we want to approach these kind of bigger questions that we've been talking about, we might say the civilizational level questions, like we need anthros and socials to like help us ask those questions. Psychology is a great field, but if we look at the human mind, that's one facet of the whole being. It's can inadvertently ignore what we were talking about before of the physicality of being.
Yeah, the collective nature of culture too, and the fact
Yeah.
that it transcends an individual. Amazing stuff here with Adam Gamwell. Got to have you on more, man. More than once every 6 years. It's pretty remarkable stuff we're getting into. Thoughts, maybe as we wrap up, takeaways, suggestions, anything you want to plug. Now's
Yeah.
your time.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. This has been fun. Agreed. Let's do it more than every 6 years. And I appreciate this too, because I mean, just as a fun fact, this is the first podcast I've recorded in about a year. I took time off doing dad stuff, so this is fun to get back on the.
You're down from the mountaintop. Yeah.
Yeah. I've come back. My beard has gotten not any longer. But I think for me, some takeaways is that like there is a lot of work ahead of us, but there's hope, right? And part of it is like get your hands dirty. Like it's fun to play with the tools. I mean, this is like basically, so practically like open a GitHub account, it's free, and then start looking around at open source software. And like, you can then start asking questions through Gemini, through GPT, through whatever about what you're seeing, and like kind of say, I'd love to see X kind of tool in the world, and that's how I started doing that. And it's been both educational and really helpful to do that. So again, it's my hope is to help get more anthropology and social science thinking into AI development and technology. So if I can be of help to anybody out there, happy to do so. You can find me at anthrocurious.com. It's exciting time. It's a scary time, exciting time to be a parent. And so if anybody else pops on that has advice and information around technology, AI, and raising kids, I'm all ears. So thank you for having me, man. This is fun.
Absolutely. I think there may be a dad's group of podcasters that may be overdue to launch at some point. Adam Gamwell, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Yeah, thank you much. We'll see you soon.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please subscribe, share the good word. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.